Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled New Approaches to Adherence and Prevention of Dropouts, the Digital Era of Patient Engagement. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Clinical Inc. for bringing everyone together for today's discussion. Clinical Inc. is the global life science company bringing together data, technology, and patient-centric research. Their deep therapeutic area of expertise, coupled with direct data capture, eCOA, e-consent, telehealth, and digital biomarkers advancements, including the use of continuous glucose monitoring for the detection of hypoglycemia, support the next generation of clinical trials and ultimately the clinical management of patients. And now, without further ado, though, I'd like to hand the mic over to our moderator for today's event, Dr. Michael Gibson, CEO, Baim Institute for Clinical Research, Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, and Interventional Cardiologist at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Dr. Gibson, you may begin when you're ready.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Mike Gibson, a professor of medicine here at Harvard Medical School. What an exciting time to be in the cardiovascular and diabetes space. I have to say, I think one of the most important presentations in the past decade was at this year's AHA, the results of the SELECT trial, where we learned that giving semaglutide to patients with heart disease reduced their risk of cardiovascular death, heart attack, and stroke by 20%. 20%. Now, I know it's a bit of an exploratory analysis, but the reduction in death was also statistically significant and clinically significant. So we are at an amazing point in cardiovascular health history. When you look at who develops heart disease, they develop heart disease largely because they have either diabetes, high blood pressure, they have, bad lipids. Well, when you have weight reduction, you lower LDL, lower triglycerides, raise HDL, you have a 42% improvement in inflammation, CRP, you lower hemoglobin A1C, you lower blood pressure. So you're simultaneously reducing all these risk factors at once. And what was fascinating about the results was that the benefits began almost before the weight loss. So again, I think it's the improvement in all of these risk factors simultaneously with weight loss that's really going to drive such an improvement in outcomes. Now we know lower is better in a lot of areas, whether it's weight or lipids or blood pressure, but now we're starting to learn earlier is better. And in the lipid area, we have cholesterol years. How many years and how high was your cholesterol? I think what we're going to learn in the obesity side is weight years. How many years were cumulatively was your weight above where it needed to be? So we have great basic science to give us great drugs. We have great clinical science to tell us, how we can improve things. But what we need is great implementation science to match all those other sciences, because great drugs, great knowledge without implementation really doesn't move the needle. We need psychometrics. We really need to understand how do we manage weight, diabetes, and heart disease all together at once, and how do we implement change? And that's what we're really trying to focus on today, is implementation, psychometrics, and how do we change people. They have a great panel joining us today. I'm going to go around the table and ask some of our panelists to weigh in, ask them to introduce themselves and weigh in. Christian, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me to join this discussion. I'm Christian Johus. I'm an MD, PhD, and I've spent the last 2 decades within drug development and device development within this cardiometabolic space. The past 4 years, because I'm a geek of heart, I've been Chief Digital Officer with Novo Nordisk in the development space, so clinical development. And for the past year, I've been consulting within life sciences on digital transformations. I think what you pointed out is extremely important. We have wonderful tools to begin treating at the root the causes of cardiovascular disease within this cardiometabolic space. But we also need to recognize that people are extremely different, and these are, to a large extent, one-size-fits-all tools. And when we look at academic guidelines from American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, World Health Organization, these elements that you touched upon in terms of psychometrics, social metrics, they're estimated to account for about 50% of what constitutes health outcomes in these patients. So beginning to have an understanding on these, what is umbrella termed social determinants of health, I think is super important. Now, social determinants of health is an umbrella term, and there's a lot of things that in the cardiometabolic space are affecting individuals, and predominantly it's getting the disease and then figuring out how to live with that disease, and specifically for these chronic diseases. And understanding behavioral drivers is going to be crucial in this regard. So I'm super excited about the opportunity to not just leave that understanding of individual behaviors up to the individual investigator, but have structured, validated approaches for how to do it within the clinical trial space, because that's going to be augmenting our understanding of the diseases. I'm looking very much forward to that, and specifically to the discussion today.
Great. Well, thanks, Christian. And you know, Christian kind of set up the why. Kevin, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the how.
Sure. My name is Kevin Dolgan. I am not a clinician. I am a behavioral scientist. So I co-founded a company here in Europe called Observia, and we focus entirely on the behavior of patients with chronic disease. And otherwise, I'm also an affiliate professor at the Sorbonne at the Université de Paris. And effectively, where I've really focused my own efforts, my own research, is in what you said, Mike, which is how can patients be helped to change their behavior, which includes, of course, adherence to medication and adherence to treatment protocols, but also, particularly in the case of cardiometabolic disease, includes typically a whole lot of other factors as well, such as diet, lifestyle, etc. I'm perhaps the proudest, or at least the most involved with the development of a behavioral diagnostic tool called SPUR. And I'm sorry to impose slides on you in an open discussion, but I do just have 2, and perhaps I could bring up the first one. The idea really behind SPUR is to provide a behavioral diagnostic in the same way that a clinician has a clinical diagnosis. If you do want to affect the behavior of an individual, then you have to understand what that person's behavioral profile is like. And I would love to get into all kinds of details about how this works and about the world of PRAMs, so patient-reported adherence measures. Some of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with some of them. There are a number. And a few years ago, I helped put together an international academic consortium with professors from the University of Michigan, Kingston in the UK, in China, here in France, to develop a framework that would allow us to build digital diagnostic tool to try to understand a patient's behavioral profile. And through that, the idea is that we can get an assessment of the patient's behavioral risk. Now, there are already PRAMs that do that and do it pretty well. But at the same time, by going digital, we wanted to develop something that was statistically somewhat more sophisticated, but that does effectively need to be applied digitally. And that also gives us not only the risk of non-adherence, but also measures of the drivers that are behind that individual's risk. So if we could perhaps go to my next and last slide. And here I could spend probably the rest of the discussion. So it's kind of all or nothing. I'm going to gloss over all of these. if you really look at the behavioral literature, there are many identified drivers of risk, behavioral risk again. And we've really focused for a variety of reasons through an extensive search of literature on 13 of these, which can be grouped into 4 major categories. So there are social drivers, for instance, lack of social support, feelings of social inadequacy, etc. There are psychological drivers, which include things like difficulty accepting an identity that includes that of patient, reactions to authority, and so on. There are usage drivers, which are more environmental and non-voluntary, which include financial burden, difficulty of accessing medication or being able to carry through with protocol. And then lastly, there are rational drivers. Those of you who know the health relief model will recognize it here. So this is the more about questions of the patient's perception of the disease and of the treatment. So effectively, SPUR is a digital interactive tool that provides for each patient a kind of cloud of numbers, and these numbers can allow us, as I mentioned, to assess their behavioral risk and also to understand what is a particular mix of drivers that are driving that risk for each individual. And so we've been discussing using SPUR in the clinical space with Clinical Inc., and it's been quite exciting, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And Mona, let's turn to you. Talk to us a little bit more about the how.
Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here. By way of introduction, my name is Mona Khalid. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I'm currently Vice President of Value Demonstration at an organization, biotech organization called Endpoint Health. I've spent many years thinking about clinical outcomes measures, not only the ones that currently exist, but new measures and deploying them in clinical trials. So I'm actually very fascinated and interested in this tool that you talked to us a little bit about, Kevin, and I'll be asking you some pointed questions later on. I personally think with the advent of new technologies, we can be doing a lot better in our clinical studies to understand treatment effect and more holistically treating the patient. We can now use these tools, as you described, Kevin, in more of a quantitative way to characterize dimensions that are really important to patient behavior. We see this also reflected in a lot of the discussions that the FDA are currently having on patient-focused drug development and the general quest to pursue health equity, determinants thereof, and then importantly, the outcomes that are related to these. And that's where I think these holistic insights are going to be really important on the patients themselves and needed in context of the next generation of studies that are put forward. So again, happy to be here, Michael, and interested in the discussion we're about to have.
Yeah, now let's turn to you, Jonathan. I mean, we have trials and now we have these tools, the psychometric tools. I know in Heartline, a trial I'm running, we have 32,000 people randomized, and we have massive numbers of ePROs, electronic patient reported outcomes, about diet, sleep, anxiety, depression, exercise. I thought no one's going to answer these questions. I mean, these are people over 65 and they're not going to do it. 95% rates of compliance with the ePROs. So yes, we can add in these kinds of questions and trying to understand people's behaviors and drivers in trials. So talk to us a little bit about, Clinical Inc. and how using your kind of platforms, we can get this information.
Yeah, so just, Mike, just by way of background introduction, I'm the CEO, Jonathan Goldman, the CEO at Clinical Inc. by training cardiologist from the UK. I was a consultant at Oxford and then an attending and faculty at University of California, San Francisco. It's interesting, you just referenced the advances we've made. 2023 SELECT trial gets published. It's possible to administer a GLP-1 and administer and provide mortality benefits, maybe even in patients who are not that obese at all, just more in the weight management category. Who would have imagined that? 35 years ago, when I started practicing, I used to work for cardiologists who, when admitting a patient with a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, those patients used to be sent home for bed rest. That's basically how we used to do it. 35 years later, it's a different story. What we did rely on 35 years ago was a lot on what was called the doctor-patient relationship and the bedside manner. And this was considered to be the primary tool whereby we would, like, it's my patient, I know who the patient is, this concept of it's my patient. A lot of that was to do with really understanding the patient's personality and behavior. And the belief was, maybe those days have gone forever, but the belief was that by leveraging the relationship between doctor and patient, you would gain some insight into their personality and therefore could not only predict their behavior, but would, by the power of your own personality and your own medical team, to influence their behavior, to ensure they adhered to their medication, that they adjusted their lifestyle, smoking, diet, and so on. And it's known particularly in diabetes that adherence is, no matter how hard you try, is poor, particularly in younger people. There is an element of rebellion that occurs, and also in all chronic diseases, adherence is particularly challenging. Now you fast forward that to the current era, doctor-patient relationship has been eroded somewhat by the Zoom generation, the Zoom era, and the era of avatars and artificial intelligence, and patients themselves having a higher degree of confidence in what a machine is telling them about their health than a human. So the time has come to try and understand how to leverage that reality, whether we like it or not, that is the reality, in the clinical trial era. And so when I think of what's the real importance of understanding personality and behavior and lifestyle, you think, well, if I'm going to reduce a factor, whether it's cholesterol, blood pressure, weight, glucose, I do a clinical trial, I'll know what the outcome of that is for a couple of years, however long it takes, and then I'll know what the benefits are. But in the real world, we don't know whether we need to maintain those benefits for the 2-year period of the clinical trial, stop the drugs, maybe the weight goes up, the mortality benefits persist, nobody knows. So I think there's definitely a difference between how do we maintain somebody's behavior and lifestyle forever, believing that that will have a forever benefit, or do you just need to make an intervention for a brief period of time and then it makes somebody better? Somebody has cancer, you cut the cancer out, they go back to their normal life. And so that's more detail than I think I'd intended to cover, but in the clinical trial setting, what we need to do is really 3 things, which is to diagnose the patient's behavioral characteristics, which is why we started partnering with Kevin and the team at Observia on SPUR. Second, to have a digital method of capturing the patient's behavior. That's partly how they think and believe, but it's also what they do. What are you eating? What are you smoking? Shouldn't be smoking? Are you adhering to your medications? And in a clinical trial setting, not to rely on a checkbox on a case report form, lifestyle advice provided, but what advice was provided, who gave it, what were the patient's beliefs and feelings? And most importantly, can you use that information to try to predict who's going to drop out of a clinical trial? And we've seen example after example in the ePro patient-reported outcome world of where patients dropped out for reasons not to do with adverse events. You don't know what would have happened to them. You kind of have to infer that. And so what I'm focused on is how can we use these tools, maybe digitizing somebody's personality is a bit crude of a description, but can you digitize somebody's personality to predict how they're going to behave, provide them consistent information, and then keep them in the clinical trial? There are many other benefits in the real world that persist for keeping a patient adherent on treatment forever or for a long period of time. But for our special window in the clinical trial world, what is it that we can do to diagnose and manage using these digital tools? So Mike, hope that was a good introduction to how I think we at Clinical Link can provide that platform.
Great. Well, thanks, Jonathan. Well, now I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit of discussion.
Sure. So, Kevin, I'm going to maybe pick on you a little bit because I'm here thinking through this new technology, looking at your wonderful slides, connecting the dots and thinking, wow, this would be great to use in some of the clinical studies I've been involved in. But But on the other side of that kind of excitement comes all of the usual kind of scientific assessments and rigor that needs to go into these tools for us to feel usually comfortable in deploying some of these tools. And one of my first questions is around, well, typically when I think of COA or a PRO assessment, we go through a very rigid process of understanding what questions we're going to ask and the cognitive debriefing of the patients of interest so that we are targeting the right questions and then validating that questionnaire as a whole so that we're pretty certain that we're asking the right questions in a limited amount so that patients don't feel overburdened, but also getting very relevant information for the context of use. And so when you were going through your background research exercise to try and digitize how a patient might behave, what are some of the studies that you've done to understand the validity of the tool itself? And have these studies been done in specific therapeutic areas? What has been the general approach around this that you and your team have taken?
That's not picking on me. That's exactly the right question. I would strongly suggest if there's any listeners who are saying, well, this is great, I can do it myself, be my guest, but do use a well-validated PRAM, right? And there are many out there, as I said, of patient-reported adherence measures. And what does well-validated mean? Well, first of all, there's a way of putting these things together. I always like to say, because I deal so much with clinicians, that I live in a world that's just as scientific. It's just not the same science and not necessarily the same protocols. But you're absolutely right, Mona. There's a way to do this. When we first developed SPUR, the first paper was published just in 2020. And then we set out to create the questionnaire, and that's where we really put together this international board of academics. I'd be very happy to share all the published papers with everybody. There was a paper that was published around the original psychometric studies, and effectively on the basis of the framework and our hypothetical framework of how decisions are made by chronic patients. We originally developed, I think we got it down to about 52 items. Ran them through significant testing, through in-depth interviews across, and those interviews were done in 4 pathologies ranging from, I believe, cardiovascular to oncology, multiple sclerosis, and so on, in 4 countries: the United States, France, China, the UK, and so on, in different languages. First of all, to make sure that the questions are understood in the way that they're supposed to be understood. And then came a series of studies where we really started statistically looking at what was the best way to put these together in such a way that actually was predictive of behavior. And there was a series of studies, I think there have been 5 now validation studies, that led us finally to the latest version of SPUR, and I sincerely hope that we'll continue to refine it. But the latest version of SPUR, which consists of 6 items that can first give a good assessment of the patient's risk, and then a further number of items, up to 24 in total, that can really start honing in the drivers behind that risk. So there is very much a process, and a well-documented one, that I would encourage everyone to take a look at. And as I said, well, first of all, I'd point out that when we started out, we had this theoretical framework, and we're hoping that we would see the shadow of this theoretical framework when we actually ran the stats. But we said, well, publish no matter what. You should always publish negative results. And luckily, we didn't have any negative results. So it turned out that our approach was validated and continues to do so. The very latest research, I was just this week, just came back from Budapest. There's a conference called ESPAComp, which is really the kind of European conference around patient adherence, where I presented a meta-analysis, in fact, of the tool over all of the previously studied cohorts. And a paper will be published on that, hopefully in Q1. And likewise, the latest research, we also tested out to see if SPUR could be predictive of a patient's PHQ-8 score and their GAD-7 score. It turns out that, of course, we can't replace these tools, but we can certainly flag people who are at risk of mental health as well. So we're very proud.
I think a hard time hearing. Anyone else having a hard time hearing Kevin?
Yes, I think Kevin's audio may have gone out. Looks like he's taking care of getting himself connected. Can you hear us, Kevin, now?
Yes, I think there was a problem with my earbuds. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I pretty much finished what I had to say, but thank you for asking the question, Mona. Certainly.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to take the opportunity to double click on that particular question around one of the topics Jonathan brought up on medication adherence specifically. Now, I know that you said that there was some work done on taking a look at the correlation between SPUR and other more commonly used medication adherence questionnaires, such as potentially the BMQ. I think I saw a poster somewhere correlating assessments to the MARS. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? And then, maybe just a 35,000 foot view on how you would characterize SPUR's ability using that data to understand patient adherence, because frankly, from my perspective, that's always data that it's hard, even when you get a lot of response in your PROs when you're conducting a study, maybe a little subjective, a little bit difficult to interpret at times, and so anything that we can use, such as a tool like SPUR, could be really helpful. But from my point of view, I'd like to understand it a little better first.
Yeah, I understand. It was interesting because I think it was Christian who said, typically in a clinical trial, and I'm just learning about the clinical trial space. I mean, we've been working extensively in kind of patient support initiatives. The clinical trials is kind of new, but I know that in clinical trials, patients can tick off whether or not they took their medication in many cases. But the thing is that already Dr. Marisky discovered in the 1980s that that's a poor indicator of whether people have actually taken their medication, right? The real question is, can you get behind actual behavior? So the first part of your question, yeah, SPUR has been highly correlated to other params, but also we've tested it where possible against clinical measures like HbA1c and diabetes, hospital relapse. In fact, hospital readmissions. There was a study last year in the BMJ Open that demonstrated that SPUR is predictive of hospital readmission in the case of COPD. So as far as possible with a param, you also try to really see that you're predictive of clinical measures. And then secondly, if possible, it's also nice to be able to measure actual adherence measures. Now, without getting too technical, there's really different ways of trying to measure actual adherence, which can range from traces of medication in blood to estimates of medication possession ratio, which is a question of how much of the drug did the patient have in their possession, which in the case of a trial is, I assume, very often 100% because the medication is delivered, in which case the real question is the patient taking it, which again in my world is more PDC, proportion days covered. And now the thing is, there's two different kinds of param, so patient reported measures. One tends to ask patients more specifics about their behavior. Did you forget your medication at any point in the last week? Does it occur that you forget your medication? Things like that. Those are extremely useful. So measures like the MMAS or MARS, et cetera, tend to be more along those lines, or Hillbone. Then there are other params that focus more on patient attitudes, trying to understand what is the patient's mindset, what is their behavioral profile, with the assumption that that profile is linked to actual behavior. And in fact, those work pretty well. So that's certainly the case for SPUR. It's the case for something like the BMQ. The thing is that the latter type of param can typically be considered to be more predictive, and secondly, can be used for a naive patient who hasn't actually started treatment yet, right? So when you're looking at different ways to measure these kinds of things in terms of your patients, you do kind of have to decide, do you want to use a more specific behavioral type param? Do you want to use a more attitudinal param? Knowing that the behavioral type param can't really give you the reasons behind non-adherence, the more attitudinal param can. And luckily, they do tend to be extremely well correlated and highly predictive. So in the meta study I just mentioned, and I'll shut up, we actually looked across different studies and found that SPUR was actually better correlated to MPR where it was available than many of the other params, even the more descriptive params, which is good news because it allows more insight.
Excellent. And Go ahead, Christian.
Thanks. So when, I mean, I've been, as I mentioned, working in clinical trials for a couple of decades, and every sponsor I know of are actually trying to provide estimates or predictive indicators of non-adherence or risk of dropouts, or whatever we want to label it as within a clinical trial. Usually it's if the patient doesn't turn up for a visit, that's a risk indicator, and other assessments are not done, etc. How do you imagine SPUR is going to be used towards the investigators? So you talked about the 13 drivers. So let's pretend I'm an investigator. Do I get kind of a risk of this particular individual in front of me has a risk of non-adherence, or how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a real key point, because just saying someone's at risk is one thing. Then the question is, what do you do about that? And I thought it was interesting when Jonathan before mentioned, as a practitioner, that physicians have always kind of assumed that by the force of their relationship, they'll affect behavior. That's true. And in fact, when I first started looking at adherence, what I found, I was analyzing some UK data, and it came out that the major predictor, and I just didn't have much data, I didn't have any params or anything, but the major predictor of whether a patient was adherent or not was who was their physician, even correcting for things like socioeconomic levels. So clearly, physicians have a major impact on their patients. The problem is it's nowhere near as much as they thought. And certain physicians are very good at that. Certain physicians are not. Certain physicians are more perspicacious. Study after study demonstrates that physicians systematically underestimate the problem with their own patients, which is normal. Now we're getting into policy questions. Physicians tend not to be trained in behavioral science and in questions of non-adherence. So it's rather surprising that when they can do a really good job. So then the question is, if you put a patient through a diagnostic that actually is saying not only the risk, but why, then typically what we do in our own work in doing interventions is the first thing is to give feedback to the patient themselves. Okay, digital feedback saying, great, it looks like you're handling things well. Think about this, right? But also to the physician saying, okay, Christian here is at moderate behavioral risk. This is what's driving that risk. Therefore, we suggest that you interact with him this way. Maybe Christian is highly reactant. He doesn't like being told what to do. From the little I know of you, Christian, that seems to be the case. In which case we'd say, okay, think about not, don't be didactic with him. Engage into shared decision making. This is how you might do that. Right? Whereas somebody else, it might be something entirely different. They have not appreciated the benefits of the medication. Somebody else, they're having social issues. Give them an example of someone who is suffering from the same disease, but is having a very active social life. So all of these different little behavioral kind of nudges, we can provide to the investigator to say, this we think is your best bet for encouraging this patient to adhere to protocol and to medication.
Cool. Kevin, if you then think that through, and this is a question that many clinical trialists will ask, in the discussions I've had with people in the weight management of diabetes space, the question comes up, so what? So what happens next? So specifically, what's reportable? We're accumulating a data set in clinical trials that we've not had before. In the past, the conversations were always occurring between site and patient, advice on lifestyle. I know you're struggling to stay in the trial. We'll help you with your transportation. We'll help you with your car parking. If you're having trouble with this adverse event, we'll give you some more support. Here's some advice. In this world, this new era that we're talking about, we have a whole data set that's brand new. It's rigorously collected. It's audited. Of this data, what is reportable? Of the data that we have, what data is going to go to the FDA and be presented in tables and listings with some kind of formal summary that goes into the question of how the drug is going to be approved or not? What data doesn't go to the FDA? It's just simple site information to help retain the patient, and there are many different tools that we use to retain patients in clinical trials where the data isn't submitted to the FDA. It's considered to be just supporting the patient. And if you're really good at it and you do a really fantastic job at supporting the patient and maintaining their lifestyle, it's not just drug adherence, right? This is lifestyle adherence we're talking about, not just the drug. So I think it's really key to focus on that. Are we actually influencing the outcome to the positive? In other words, if you believe that lifestyle alone has got some influence in cardiovascular outcomes, that at least in the cardiology world, we used to think that was the case, then are you influencing the outcome of the trial by these actions? Not like you're not just keeping people adherent in the trial, you might be independently improving the placebo response. So what are your thoughts? And Mike, I suppose you might direct the panel to some of those questions. And I know you have your own opinion on it.
Yeah, Mona, what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Jonathan. As I'm thinking about the behavioral component of SPUR, that's almost an intervention on its own, and the water gets a little muddy, right? So if you're trying to conceivably understand the effect of a medication, and you're also deploying a secondary intervention, how are you sure that your medication is the actual thing that is making the difference where you're assessing clinical efficacy? I think generally my view is in the future there will be a need to go beyond the pill of sorts rather than the traditional way we test medical interventions. But I think for the context of this discussion, it would be really helpful to understand that dichotomization of understanding the risk factors at baseline and how to potentially design an optimal study where those risk factors are balanced so that you may be getting an even number of patients that are at high risk to drop out at the beginning of your study, regardless of what treatment assignment they have. And then the second part, which is kind of the trial plus, or the support of the trial to ensure that the patients are well managed, to that third part of actually intervening and how the tool can be modulated to deploy those functionalities. That would be great to understand a little bit more about.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about intervening. I mean, I take a monthly injectable, and I had my calendar set up to, it's the first of the month, you need to inject yourself. And then I got busy, and then I haven't injected myself. So we need reminders. We need even better tools than just one reminder. We need to remind someone like me to do it until I get it done, So giving someone a reminder is one thing, or saying, are you adherent? But really driving them is really important. So what do you have to say, Kevin?
Well, this is a little bit outside of my habitual wheelhouse, right? Because
Kevin, could you talk repeatedly till I take my medicine? Is that one way we could intervene?
I'll be happy to keep bothering you, Michael, but I'd need to understand exactly what's driving you to forget it. But that's another question. As I was saying, this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse because, again, clinical trials is not my specialty. But this question came up at ESPICOMP, and it was interesting. There was a whole discussion about the use of PRAMs and, in general, adherence augmentation methodology in clinical trials at ESPICOMP. And this was the first time I've seen this subject applied there. And there was a response by Bernard Vrigens, who was one of the founders of ESPICOMP and a key European researcher in the domain. And he said, his response was interesting, but he says that very often people carrying out clinical trials overestimate the problem because A, what we're trying to do is make sure that people are adhering to the protocol that was already, delivered to the. I mean, theoretically, one assumes that people in a clinical trial are actually adhering to the protocol, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that's the case. That's the first issue. And secondly, he said, furthermore, let's face it, they're filling out diaries, they're seeing their physicians more often, they're getting much more feedback and direct interaction with the physician. If somebody is involved in a clinical trial, they're not getting care as usual. And on the other hand, one thing that's clear is that it has to be sure that the same approach is being used with everybody across the different arms. It's fully double-blinded. That's true. But his point, which was interesting, was that it's really it should be no more of an issue than the underlying way the trials are done right now.
Yeah, Christian, your thoughts?
Yeah, so of course this would be kind of a seated intervention as well, right? If we were to do this, so I see it in a process. As I mentioned, starting out, I've really been lacking this within clinical trial domain, ability to, in a structured manner, characterize, not necessarily influence, but characterize. Because when we look at how medications are behaving within a clinical trial and how they're behaving in the real world, there's often a delta, right? So you have your efficacy assessments conducted in a phase 3 confirmatory program, and they differ often from the effectiveness that you capture in the real world. most of this is due to what you just talked about, Kevin, that the tender loving care is higher within a clinical trial space than it is within clinical care in general, right? For me, I mean, you pointed it out, Jonathan. The tender loving care by a physician or often study coordinators having a rapport with the patients in a clinical trial is super important. So it's being done anyways. It's just been very heterogeneously done across the space, and we have no insights to it. And I think we are lacking that insight. So from my point, it's getting a structured approach to characterize. Then later on, we can figure out how to influence. Because I'm with you, Mona. The drug seems myopic in this era. There are so many other avenues to influence how health outcomes are brought about. Specifically digital derived. So yes, Mike, you will have a gizmo giving you jolts if you haven't taken it at some point in time, or whatever flips your boat, right? But having exactly right. But at some point in time, it's not going to be the drug; it's going to be the product, and that product, in my mind, is going to be different, right? But I'm not scared about having a structured approach to what's already happening and getting data to begin understanding the populations that we recruit into clinical trials, because currently on the behavioral aspects of that, we don't have nothing. We just have faith, and I'm hope is not a strategy, as they say.
Hey, can I jump in just for a second? One of the things that comes out for them, we do a lot of interventions with hospitals, for instance, notably in France, and notably with things like patient education initiatives. And in fact, on Saturday, I'm co-presenting with a cardiologist here in France at the International Vascular Health Society about something we put together at the Boulogne Hospital, where there's a team of individuals intervening with patients to help them to understand their medication, to kind of follow up to primarily to people who have had cardiac events. And one of the things that came out to our approach was that he said, in reality, that led to a greater homogeneity of how the patient is dealt with, because up until then, everybody had their own approach. Every physician has their own. What do you say to somebody when they ask that kind of question? Well, by providing them with guidelines and ideas about how to handle certain behavioral profiles, we're actually bringing more homogeneity into the approach.
There's a huge difference here, right? So patients that are within in different cultural settings are more or less authoritative towards their investigators, or more or less authoritative towards their study coordinators. So having structured approaches to how to assess this within a clinical trial, not necessarily to intervene, but characterize, I think is utmost important.
And I'm gonna piggyback off your comment, Christian, and maybe again direct it back to Kevin because of the interest around this specific tool. It's around the studies that you've actually done on this behavioral aspect of being able to intervene on what I'm hearing are these behavioral phenotypes that you've been able to distinguish. Can you tell us a little bit about the results of those, which areas you've done this type of research in, if you've started this work, and what the effect of this kind of management is on the outcomes that you've been looking at?
Sure. We haven't published yet on the effect of interventions using SPUR and so on. This is coming. So far, all of our research has been on the validation of the diagnostic tool. Now, that being said, it has been used with tens of maybe 40, 50,000 patients up until now in various programs around the world. And we have seen these results. And for example, it has been used in personalized intervention with patients. And again, this is outside the clinical studies domain, right? But personalized intervention for patients with type 2 diabetes in an Asian country, a Southeast Asian country, where we saw really phenomenal differences in A, the use of insulin, and B, actual glycemic control. That particular company actually had an intervention arm and a control arm. And we saw really, really marked differences in both. And what's interesting as well is that those differences were lasting after the end of the program. This was an interventional program that I think lasted for 6 months. And even after 12 months, we saw that there were still persistent significant differences in glycemic control across the two populations. Because the idea here, outside of the clinical, but even inside clinical studies, the idea is not simply to jolt somebody when they forget, and I swear, Mike, we'd never jolt anybody, but
well, okay, I need it.
at least metaphorically, right? But the idea, because I have a feeling you're probably pretty adherent when it comes down to it, but for most people, it is the creation of a habit. I mean, we're talking about diagnosis today more than intervention, but from an interventional perspective, what we really like to do, and again, outside the clinical research domain, is to say, once we have a behavioral diagnosis, then we can start incorporating that into like a digital CBT program that is designed to bring people through a kind of Prochaska wheel to a point where adhering to their medication and to their recommendations is habit. That is lasting, as opposed to simply, sending a reminder. If the reminder doesn't come up, somebody doesn't take the medication, right? In the end point, in terms of really adding to patient well-being, getting the kinds of results I just described, is the habit formation that makes it lasting.
You know, what's interesting is, talk about habit. I'm really good taking all my morning pills. No problem. It's a habit. But a once a month thing is hard. It's hard to get a habit around a once a month intervention.
Yeah, what you have to do is you have to find a monthly trigger in your life. It's more difficult. It's even worse. Like, for instance, in MS, we've worked a lot. There are some that are weekly, some that are daily, some that are once every 2, 3. Those are difficult. All right.
Like a once a month call from Mona. That's what I'm going to look for. Yes.
There you go. But give me a call afterwards. We'll talk about strategies for habit formation on a monthly basis.
But Kevin, isn't that exactly it, right? Because for some, twice a week would be fantastic. For some, once a month is great. We just have no clue in terms of how to tailor that particular intervention methodology to the individual in front of us. So back to Jonathan's comment, right? We now have an opportunity to characterize within a clinical trial, and we can actually do after the fact analysis on figuring out who actually did great on this stuff, who had the best efficacy, who had the best benefit risk profile relative to how the intervention was actually performed. So we're better at getting insights in terms of who is this drug better for, thus moving closer to precision medicine, or maybe even personalized medicine. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That comes back to Jonathan's point before in terms of what to do with the data. I don't know what you need to report. I would assume not much when it really comes down to it, because again, we're trying to keep people to protocol. But I know what we could do with that data together, which is already, in terms of the sponsors of that trial, be able to say to them, what kinds of drivers do we see that are affecting behavior in this population with this medication in these different countries, to help prepare for how best to guide physicians in terms of how to deal with those different people, and how best to put together patient support programs in different markets to make sure that the drug lives up to its clinical promise. Because as Christian said, why are there differences in real world evidence as opposed to clinical evidence? Because it's not the same context, right? And we want, anybody who's launching a drug onto the market would like to be able to demonstrate it's living up to the promise of the trial, and that means helping the patient to adhere. And you can gather that data during the trial to help better intervene with them afterwards.
Well, we have this problem in inpatient care too, of in the cath lab, I can say, give Mrs. Jones, an aspirin, but we don't rely on that. We rely on closed loop communication. The nurse says, I gave Miss Jones an aspirin. So it's not enough to tell someone to do something. You also have to close the loop with, yes, I did what you said. Where are we going in the future? So, tell us what you see in the future, Mona.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on it a few points in the discussion, but I do think with the advent of these technologies, the availability of more chronic medications, such as the GLP-1s that we've been seeing, which are lifelong interventions, that we will need to think more holistically about patient management and patient care. And that goes to say that we need to understand how a patient's outcomes are correlating with a combination of interventions, in a sense, right? So what is the maximal benefit you can deliver a patient? It's not just a therapy on its own. It's not just a behavioral intervention on its own. It's the totality, or it's the sum of those parts. And if we can get to a stage where we're actually looking at the patient as a unit, understanding the data that would help us get to that spot. We're not there yet. I think that's what excites me, and that's where I think more and more people are kind of interested in terms of wellness, in terms of patient management, in terms of healthcare delivery, in terms of implementation science, a lot of what you mentioned earlier, Mike. So I think it's something that we can't ignore, and with the information, the capabilities, the progression in the mining of vast amounts of data, we're perfectly positioned to start charting this new territory.
Christian, the future?
Can I go back to the past before I answer about the future?
It's always good to know what happened in the past to know what's going to happen in the future.
So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember diabetes prevention program. So this was a really, really sturdy program in terms of group work to change behaviors. It worked, not as good as popping a pill, right? Metformin. It worked. It was just not cost effective at that point in time. Now the world has changed. We have technologies available in everyone's hand with the power to do these in a cost-effective manner. So I believe, back to my statement before around the efficacy versus effectiveness, that gap is to some extent, large extent, attributable to that social determinants of health, which to some extent can be done with ability to adhere to advice from your HCPs or ability to take the medication as you wanted it. If technologies can bridge that gap, and I believe they can, that's going to be awesome. And then we're back to not just having the drug, which to a large extent is a one-size-fits-all today. There are, of course, precision medicines being developed, right? But within the space of cardiometabolic diseases, it is a one-size-fits-all. Then you augment that experience with something that is much more frequent than visiting your physician every 6-9 months. And you can do it within the technology to make it cater to me as an individual. So that's my imminent future, and there are things popping up. The trick is to figure out how the ecosystems are actually conducive for this, because U.S. healthcare is different than French healthcare, than UK healthcare, than etc. So understanding how these technologies would fit into that ecosystem of caregiving is going to be crucial. But the technologies exist, and I think, I mean, maybe you haven't really hit it exactly where we wanted first time around, Kevin, but it's a very good start, and you know, good is on the way to great, right?
Yeah, healthcare delivery is different everywhere, but human nature is pretty similar. Kevin, we got a few questions coming in. How often should we be applying the SPUR assessment? And also with the SPUR framework, how do you quantify the information collected and what number indicates at-risk patients?
That's a really good question, and it's kind of technical. So I'll answer the first one. It kind of depends on what you're doing. Certainly at initiation of some kind of intervention with the patient, including a trial, and then roughly speaking, probably every 6 months. But keep in mind that the way SPUR was, if you're really into stats, it wasn't designed using things like factor analysis. It was designed using rash modeling, and as such, you don't need to go through the entire thing. You can say, okay, these elements are probably more or less stable for this patient. These seem to be moving around. We can just ask these 1 or 2 items. So there are ways to apply it without necessarily going through the entire thing. So that's a quick answer to the first question. The second question is a little bit more complicated. Just about any param is going to give you a relative measure of risk across a population. And then the way to calibrate the entire thing is to say, we know typically from epidemiological data, what is the kind of distribution of adherence or non-adherent behavior across that population. And as such, you could fit the 2 curves. Now, as it is, we've now done SPUR with enough patients that we can start drawing some default curves that in reality turn out to be pretty stable. So typically what occurs if we're applying it for a given population is we'll start with a default and we'll adjust as we see data coming in. But actually we're relatively comfortable with the kind of cutoff levels in terms of what's kind of high, medium, and low risk.
And for those people who show a high adherence likelihood, what measures do you recommend to ensure that the expected meets what they're actually doing?
I assume you mean high non-adherence.
Well, yeah, I think they said adherence, but they probably meant the other.
Well, that's the entire crux of the matter. Is it all depends on what the drivers of that non-adherence are from. So, for example, very typically, clinicians and pharma and payers will tend to run towards pure kind of information dump. They assume that the issue is educational. And part of that is because most patients, when you ask them, why did you not take the medication or why are you not taking the medication, the number one response typically, at least outside the United States and out-of-pocket markets, is because either side effects or I don't think the drug is effective. Now, that's what might be what they believe, but in many cases, if you're into behavioral science, we know we rationalize our irrational choices as well. So it might be that if you just automatically assume I have to provide information about the drug, then it's kind of like trying to convince a flat earther that the world is spherical, right? Because it's really coming from some other more ideological thing. So I can't answer that with one answer. If I could, there'd be no room to have spur in the world. You could just use, another straightforward param. We have to know what the drivers are for that patient. Then we can choose the appropriate intervention with the patient.
We have a question here for Christian. If I'm planning a 10% dropout rate in my trial, to what extent could SPUR reduce the dropout rate?
It depends. I don't know. It's going to be the honest answer. I think the data that Kevin alluded to before in terms of seeing real world better adherence to medications and to showing up for visits, etc., because it's not just adherence to the drug, right? It's being able to follow the advice you're given. That indicates the dropout is going to be lower. Am I going to bet a program on that? Nope. But I will, as I mentioned before, I'm super excited about the opportunity to characterize in a structured manner. And I'm also fairly happy about that if the sample sizes are steady, and they probably are, right? I wouldn't change my sample size based on this. Then my power on my primary, secondary, and exploratory endpoints are going to increase. So I don't think the dropouts are going to change. I wouldn't bet on dropouts changing first time around. Maybe we can do that down the road, but I don't see any downside. You get data. Back to Jonathan's point, you can chunk the data afterwards. This is most likely going to be used as an exploratory analysis for the data part, right? So that's how I would address it. No, a hope for reduced dropouts, but I wouldn't bet on it.
So Jonathan, let's kind of wrap up here in the final minutes with you. How do you take all this together and implement it within Clinical Inc?
So we do have a partnership with Observia to deploy this tool within our clinical trial solution set. And how I think of it is these are the kinds of questions that you would expect a principal investigator or a study coordinator to ask the patient anyway. If you sign this consent form, do you plan to stay in the trial? Many people will sign the consent form, but it's like buying a Peloton. You have good intentions at the beginning, and then after 6 months, not so much. At least you're getting information at the level of the sponsor and getting insight to the patient's thinking that you would not have had before. I don't think that's introducing bias in a trial. I think that's reducing it. It's identifying who's at risk of dropping out, not due to adverse events, and making sure that you know who those patients are. And this was always this stuff has always been the case. There's always been 30% of patients at risk of dropping out, of whom 10% or 15% actually do. This is providing the sponsor information and provides an ability for us as clinical trialists to provide the right kind of support at both patient and site level. I'd like to, Mike, thank you so much for moderating the session as well. As an experienced clinical trialist, you're better able than anyone I know to speak to these. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I'm a patient too, so I'm always interested in what can we do to improve adherence and compliance. I found the discussion fascinating and engaging. I want to thank all of you, you, Jonathan, and Mona, Christian, Kevin. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for that very insightful presentation. And we have reached the end of our time here today. If we couldn't get to your questions though during the Q&A, know that the team at Clinical Inc. will follow up with you, or if you have some further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on the screen. I want to thank the audience for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Additionally, there's a link to view the recording of this event, which you can share with your colleagues and you'll find in the chat window. And so please consider doing that so that they can register for the recording here as well. Please join me though, everyone, once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.